Oh, look at you crying over that little thing. How pathetic.
Adeline's stepsister laughed when she inherited only the puppy. The sound was high and brittle, slicing through the suffocating air of the solicitor's office like cracking porcelain. Adeline pulled the scruffy terrier closer to her chest, feeling her entire future collapse into this single, devastating moment. Then the outer doors crashed open. Tristan, the Duke of Atherton, strode into the room. His commanding presence silenced the whispers as his dark eyes swept past Cressida's triumphant smirk, past the murmuring witnesses, and settled on the trembling dog in Adeline's arms. "That terrier," he stated, his voice a low rumble that cut through Cressida's mirth like a blade through gossamer, "is the last living descendant of the Royal Atherton hunting line. By the covenant of the 14th year of Henry IV, the dog and its immediate custodian fall under my direct charge." His gaze finally met Adeline's. Miss Adeline is under the protection of the Atherton Charter now. The entire gathering froze in stunned disbelief. But what does this ancient charter truly demand? Is Adeline being saved? Or has she simply become another valuable possession of a cold, aristocratic duke? And why would the formidable Duke of Atherton care so fiercely about one small, unremarkable dog? My beautiful family. Before we continue Adeline's journey, I need to share something that breaks my heart. 97% of you are watching without subscribing. That means stories like this, tales of second chances, of wounded hearts finding healing, of love that doesn't come easy but comes true, might not reach the people who need them most. Your mother, your sister, your best friend going through a hard time. They're scrolling right past hope because the algorithm doesn't know you care. One click changes that. Subscribe so we can bring these stories to everyone who needs to believe in new beginnings. Now, let's see what happens when Adeline accepts the Duke's offer. The fire in the solicitor's office had been allowed to burn low. Adeline sat perfectly upright on the worn velvet settee that had been positioned, deliberately she was certain, at the furthest corner from the struggling warmth of the hearth. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced to conceal their trembling. Between her feet, hidden in the protective shadow of her morning skirts, Finn pressed his warm body against her ankles. The terrier's steady breathing was the only reassurance she had left. Across the room, her stepsister Cressida reclined against the marble mantelpiece, like a painting of absolute victory. Her gown was new, commissioned from London the very week their father had taken his final turn, in emerald silk that skirted the boundaries of mourning propriety without quite violating it. Her jewelry caught every flicker of firelight, topaz at her throat, pearl and gold combs gleaming in her elaborately arranged hair. Cressida's fingers traced the delicate chain of a locket, their mother's locket, the one Adeline's mother had cherished, now hanging possessively from her stepsister's neck. Everything about Cressida was calculated, polished, victorious. Adeline glanced down at her own dress, the plainest black crepe she owned, purchased years ago for a distant relation's funeral, now worn threadbare at the cuffs and hem. The fabric showed the strain of repeated alterations, small tucks and releases that spoke of seasons of making do. The style was hopelessly plain. No ornamentation, no fashionable draping, nothing that might draw the eye. The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It lashed against the tall windows with relentless persistence, turning the streets of London beyond into a watercolor study in gray and despair. 3 days since they had laid her father to rest in the family vault. 3 days of suffocating silence, of Cressida's barely concealed glee, of watching servants subtly redirect their deference to the new mistress of the household. Mr. Thornbury cleared his throat and adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles. The parchment rustled as he unfolded it, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy quiet. "The last will and testament of Edward James Harrington, Esquire," he began, his voice professionally neutral. "Being of sound mind and body on this 21st day of September, 1839. Adeline's fingernails pressed crescents into her palms. Beneath her skirts, Finn shifted, sensing her rising dread. The legal phrases washed over her like a suffocating tide, whereas, and heretofore, and in consideration thereof, until Mr. Thornbury's voice sharpened with unmistakable clarity. "To my beloved daughter, Adeline Margaret Harrington," Mr. Thornbury read, and Adeline's heart lifted despite herself, a desperate flutter of hope in the crushing weight of grief. "I bequeath my faithful companion, the terrier known as Finn, trusting that she will provide him the same devoted care he has shown me in my final days." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Cressida laughed. It was a high, crystalline sound, brittle with contempt and barely suppressed triumph. She pressed one gloved hand to her mouth in a mockery of surprise, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "The dog?" she gasped between peals of laughter. "Only the dog? Oh, how perfectly appropriate." Mr. Thornbury's mouth tightened into a thin line of professional disapproval, but he continued with determined neutrality. "To my stepdaughter, Miss Cressida Albright, I leave the remainder of my estate, including Harrington House and all properties, investments, and possessions therein, in gratitude for the companionship she and her late mother provided in my later years." The words fell like stones into dark water, each one sinking Adeline deeper into the cold reality of her situation. Everything. Cressida had inherited everything. The house where Adeline had been born, her mother's belongings, the small quarterly income that might have allowed her some independence. All of it now belonged to her stepsister. "How generous Papa was," Cressida said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she straightened from the mantelpiece. "To think of dear Adeline's attachment to that mangy creature. Though I do wonder where she'll keep him. The servants' quarters in my household hardly allow for pets." "Your household?" Adeline's voice emerged smaller than she intended. "Well, naturally. You didn't imagine I would turn you out onto the streets, did you?" Cressida's smile was sharp as cut glass. "I'm prepared to offer you a position. My lady's maid has been dreadfully incompetent lately. The work would suit you. You've always had such a talent for making old things presentable." The humiliation burned in Adeline's throat like acid. Around the room, the handful of witnesses, distant cousins who had come hoping for minor bequests, the family physician, Mr. Thornbury's clerk, averted their eyes with practiced discomfort. This was not their concern. This was the natural order of inheritance, the expected hierarchy of stepdaughters and dependencies. "I'll need an answer by sunset," Cressida continued, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "If you choose to refuse my generous offer, well, I can hardly be responsible for what becomes of you, or your dog." Finn whimpered softly, and Adeline reached down to stroke his rough fur with trembling fingers. A lady's maid, a servant in her own childhood home, at the beck and call of a woman who had tormented her since the day her father had remarried. The alternative was the streets, a governess position if she was extraordinarily fortunate, or... The outer doors burst open with a resounding crash. Every head turned toward the entrance as a tall figure stepped into the room, rain dripping from the shoulders of his greatcoat. The Duke of Atherton commanded immediate attention. There was no other word for the way his presence seemed to fill the space, pushing aside the petty cruelties and small humiliations like clearing smoke from a room. Tristan Blackwood was a man built of sharp angles and aristocratic severity. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from the weather. his jaw set in a line that suggested he was accustomed to absolute authority. But it was his eyes that held Adeline frozen, winter gray and penetrating. They swept the room with barely concealed contempt before settling on the terrier, trembling against her ankles. "Your Grace," Mr. Thornbury stammered, rising so quickly he nearly knocked over his inkwell. "We were not expecting, that is, I was not aware you had been informed." "I was not informed," the Duke said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I was conducting research into the Atherton estates when I came across a rather interesting genealogical record. A record concerning the Harrington household." He moved further into the room with the fluid grace of a predator, his attention never wavering from Finn. Adeline instinctively tightened her hold on the dog, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That terrier," the Duke stated, pointing one long finger at Finn, "is the last living descendant of the Royal Atherton hunting line. A bloodline that was declared extinct 40 years ago." Cressida's laugh was uncertain now, brittle at the edges. "Surely your Grace is mistaken. That's nothing but a common, 'I am not mistaken.'" The words were delivered with such absolute certainty that Cressida's mouth snapped shut. "The markings are unmistakable. The white blaze, the specific pattern of the brindle, the shape of the ears. I have studied the portraits in Atherton Abbey extensively." He withdrew a folded document from inside his coat, the parchment yellow with age and bearing an elaborate wax seal. "By the covenant established in the 14th year of Henry IV, any descendant of the Atherton royal hunting line, regardless of current ownership, falls under the direct protection and custodianship of the Duke of Atherton. Furthermore, the immediate guardian of said animal is bound by the same charter." The Duke's gaze finally lifted to meet Adeline's, and she felt the weight of it like a physical force. "Miss Adeline Harrington is under the protection of the Atherton Charter now," he declared. "She and the dog will remove to Atherton Abbey immediately, where they will reside under my direct care until such time as the terms of the charter are fulfilled." The silence was deafening. Cressida's face had gone pale, then flushed an ugly red. "This is absurd. You cannot simply claim, 'I can, and I have.'" The Duke's voice dropped to a tone that brooked no argument. "The law is ancient but binding. Mr. Thornbury, I trust you'll find everything in order." The solicitor's hands shook as he examined the document, his spectacles sliding down his nose. "This appears to be, that is, the seal is genuine, and the language is quite clear. Then we are finished here." The Duke turned his full attention to Adeline, and she felt herself pinned beneath the intensity of his scrutiny. "Miss Harrington, do you accept the protection of the Atherton Charter?" Adeline looked down at Finn, then at Cressida's furious face, then at the cold, commanding Duke who had just upended her entire world. She had no money, no prospects, and no future beyond servitude or ruin. "I accept," she whispered. The Duke's carriage was a monument to aristocratic luxury that made Adeline acutely aware of every threadbare patch on her mourning dress. The interior was upholstered in deep burgundy velvet, with brass fittings that gleamed even in the gray afternoon light. A small brazier provided warmth that seemed almost decadent after the cold solicitor's office. And the suspension was so refined that the cobblestones of London barely registered as they pulled away from the only home she had ever known. Adeline sat rigidly on one bench, Finn trembling in her lap, while the Duke occupied the opposite seat with the same commanding presence he had brought to the reading of the will. He had not spoken since handing her into the carriage, his attention focused on a leather portfolio he had withdrawn from a compartment beneath his seat. The silence stretched between them like a physical barrier. Finn, who had never been particularly good at respecting barriers, suddenly squirmed free from Adeline's grasp and launched himself across the carriage with an enthusiastic yap. "Finn, no!" Adeline lunged forward, but the terrier had already planted his muddy paws on the Duke's immaculate gray trousers, his tail wagging with the friendly obliviousness of a dog who had never learned his place. The Duke's expression remained utterly neutral as he regarded the creature now attempting to climb into his lap. "He is energetic." "I'm so sorry, Your Grace." Adeline reached across the space between them, trying to extract the dog without actually touching the Duke himself, a feat that proved nearly impossible in the confined space. Her fingers brushed against his knee and she jerked back as if burned. He's not usually so forward. The stress of the day has unsettled him. Has it unsettled him? Or you? The Duke's gray eyes lifted to meet hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then, with careful deliberation, he lifted Finn and deposited him back onto Adeline's bench. "Keep him contained, if you please. We have matters to discuss." Adeline clutched Finn tightly, feeling the dog's rapid heartbeat against her palms, or perhaps it was her own pulse thundering in her ears. The Duke extracted a document from his portfolio, the parchment crisp and official-looking. "The Atherton Charter is quite specific in its requirements, Miss Harrington. I thought it prudent to clarify the terms of our arrangement before we arrive at the Abbey." "Of course, Your Grace." Adeline forced herself to meet his gaze, though everything in her wanted to look away from that penetrating scrutiny. "You are to serve as Finn's primary custodian," he began, his tone suggesting he was reading from a contract he had memorized. "This includes all aspects of his care: feeding, exercise, grooming, and medical attention. You will maintain detailed records of his daily habits, diet, and any changes in his behavior or health." Finn chose that moment to sneeze directly into Adeline's face. The Duke's expression did not change, though Adeline could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "You will reside at Atherton Abbey for the duration of the custodianship. Appropriate quarters will be provided, separate from the family wing. You will take your meals in your rooms unless specifically invited to dine elsewhere." The message was clear. She was not a guest. She was not family. She was an employee, bound to the estate by an ancient law and the accident of her father's choice of pet. "You will be provided with a quarterly allowance for personal expenses," the Duke continued, "as well as a clothing budget appropriate to your station. Any expenditures related to Finn's care will be covered separately by the estate." "My station?" Adeline's voice emerged smaller than she intended. "You are the custodian of a valuable animal, Miss Harrington. Not a companion, not a ward, and certainly not." He paused, and for the first time, something flickered across his austere features that might have been discomfort. "You will be treated with the respect due to someone performing an essential service for the Atherton line. Nothing more, nothing less." Finn, apparently bored with being still, began gnawing on the ribbon of Adeline's bonnet. "I understand, Your Grace." She gently extracted the ribbon from the terrier's teeth, feeling the weight of her new reality settling over her like a heavy cloak. She had escaped Cressida's cruelty only to become a glorified servant to a dog. The irony would have been laughable if it were not so utterly humiliating. The Duke produced a pen and inkwell from his portfolio with the efficiency of a man accustomed to conducting business anywhere. "I'll need your signature acknowledging these terms." Adeline took the pen with trembling fingers, acutely aware of how close she had to lean across the carriage to reach the document balanced on the Duke's knee. She could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, leather perhaps, or the reins still clinging to his coat. Her hand shook as she signed her name, the letters emerging shaky and uncertain. "There is one additional clause," the Duke said as she withdrew. The charter requires that Finn produce offspring to continue the bloodline. Once a suitable mate has been identified and the breeding successfully completed, your custodianship will be considered fulfilled. Heat flooded Adeline's cheeks at the clinical discussion of breeding, though the Duke's expression remained impassive. How long might that take, Your Grace? Months? Perhaps a year? He returned the document to his portfolio with decisive finality. The Atherton hunting line has specific requirements. Not any terrier will suffice. Finn, oblivious to his role in this bizarre arrangement, had now discovered a loose thread on the velvet upholstery and was attacking it with single-minded determination. "Finn, stop that!" Adeline pulled him away from the seat, earning an indignant yip. The terrier immediately redirected his attention to the Duke's boots, sniffing them with intense interest. "He seems to have taken a liking to you, Your Grace," Adeline observed, then immediately regretted the informal comment. The Duke's eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the London streets give way to open countryside. "Dogs are loyal to whoever feeds them, Miss Harrington. It would be unwise to mistake instinct for affection." The words seemed directed at more than just the dog. "Of course, Your Grace." Adeline settled, back against the velvet cushions, Finn finally quieting in her lap as the warmth and rhythm of the carriage lulled him toward sleep. The silence resumed, but it felt different now, weighted with unspoken rules and careful boundaries. She was entering a new cage, Adeline realized. Perhaps more comfortable than the one Cressida had offered, certainly more elegant, but a cage nonetheless. The Duke had rescued her, but only because she came attached to something he valued. She was not a person to him. She was merely Finn's necessary appendage. Atherton Abbey rose from the Yorkshire moors like a statement carved in stone, imposing, ancient, and utterly indifferent to the comfort of those who gazed upon it. The edifice sprawled across the hillside in wings and towers that spoke of centuries of additions, each generation of dukes leaving their architectural mark. Gray stone darkened by weather and time gave the structure a brooding quality that the weak afternoon sun did nothing to soften. Adeline's breath caught as the carriage rounded the final bend in the long gravel drive. She had expected grandeur, but not this. Not the sheer, overwhelming presence of a building that had witnessed the rise and fall of kings, the passage of wars, the turning of ages. "It's magnificent," she whispered, then immediately felt foolish for speaking aloud. The Duke did not look up from his papers. "It's a responsibility." The weight in those 3 words silenced any further comment. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, met them in the entrance hall with the kind of austere efficiency that suggested she had been running Atherton Abbey since the stones were first laid. She was a tall woman, rail-thin, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe knot and eyes that missed nothing. "Your Grace?" She curtsied with practiced precision. "Miss Harrington's rooms have been prepared in the east wing, as you instructed." "The blue suite?" the Duke asked, already moving toward his study, his greatcoat billowing behind him. "Yes, Your Grace, with the adjoining sitting room for the animals' accommodation." Adeline noticed Mrs. Holloway did not say dog, but animal, with the same careful neutrality one might use to describe a holy relic or a piece of valuable art. "See that Miss Harrington is settled. I'll expect a full report on the animal's condition before dinner." The Duke disappeared into the shadows of a corridor without another word, leaving Adeline standing in the cavernous entrance hall with Finn tucked under her arm and the distinct sensations of being a package that had been delivered and must now be properly stored. Mrs. Holloway's sharp eyes swept over Adeline, cataloging every detail of her worn morning dress and scuffed boots. "This way, Miss Harrington." The east wing was a maze of corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced dukes and duchesses, their painted eyes seeming to follow Adeline's progress with aristocratic judgment. The blue suite, when they finally reached it, was larger than the entire upper floor of the house Adeline had grown up in. The sitting room was furnished in delicate French style, all gilt edges and pale upholstery that made Adeline terrified to sit down. The bedroom beyond was dominated by a four-poster bed hung with heavy blue damask, and tall windows that overlooked the moors, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "You'll take your meals here," Mrs. Holloway said, indicating a small table near the fireplace. "Unless His Grace requests your presence elsewhere, which I expect will be rarely. A maid will attend you twice daily. The Duke has left specific instructions regarding the animal's feeding schedule." She produced a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to Adeline with the gravity of someone delivering state secrets. Adeline unfolded it to find several pages of detailed notes in a precise, masculine hand. The Duke's handwriting, she realized, studying the careful formation of each letter. He had documented Finn's ancestry going back 7 generations, complete with dates, breeding pairs, and distinguishing characteristics. There were sketches of markings, measurements of proportion, and extensive notes on temperament and training. "His Grace has been researching the Atherton hunting line for 3 years," Mrs. Holloway said, something almost like approval entering her tone. "He located breeding records in the family archives that had been forgotten for decades. When he discovered that your father's terrier matched the historical descriptions, he traveled to London immediately. 3 years of research. For a dog. The Duke takes his responsibilities very seriously," Adeline said carefully. "The Duke," Mrs. Holloway replied with pointed emphasis, "understands that the Atherton name means something. That duty is not a burden to be shirked, but a sacred trust." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Dinner is at 8. You will not be expected to attend this evening, but His Grace requests that you bring the animal to the library at 9 o'clock. He wishes to conduct an examination." After the housekeeper departed, Adeline sank onto the blue damask settee despite her earlier misgivings, Finn immediately jumping up beside her in flagrant violation of what was surely proper behavior for furniture this expensive. She returned to the Duke's notes, running her fingers over the meticulous diagrams. There was something oddly intimate about seeing his handwriting, about glimpsing the hours of careful research contained in these pages. He had drawn Finn's exact ear shape from 3 different angles. He had noted the precise shade of brindle in the coat, comparing it to historical descriptions using terms like burnt umber and autumn bracken. This was not the work of a man who viewed Finn as merely valuable. This was obsession, or something very close to it. At 9 o'clock precisely, Adeline made her way through the darkened corridors to the library, following the directions a young maid had provided. Finn trotted beside her, his nails clicking on the polished floors, tail wagging with the cheerful ignorance of a dog who did not understand he was the last hope of a dying bloodline. The library was a cathedral of books, soaring 2 stories high, with a gallery running the perimeter and more volumes than Adeline had ever seen in one place. A fire crackled in the massive hearth, and the Duke stood before it, silhouetted against the flames, like a figure from a Gothic romance. "Miss Harrington?" He turned, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Bring him here, please." Adeline approached, suddenly nervous, as the Duke knelt to examine Finn with the careful attention of a jeweler assessing a rare gemstone. His hands were surprisingly gentle as they explored the terrier's structure, checking teeth, examining paws, running fingers along the spine with professional precision. "He's in acceptable condition, though somewhat underweight," the Duke murmured, more to himself than to Adeline. "The coat needs improvement. We'll adjust his diet immediately." "He's been grieving," Adeline said before she could stop herself. "For my father." They were constant companions. The Duke's hands stilled for just a moment. "Animals do not grieve, Miss Harrington. They simply adapt to new circumstances." But there was something in his voice, a hollowness that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Of course, Your Grace," Adeline replied, watching as he continued his examination with the focused intensity of a man for whom duty was the only language he knew how to speak. She was a necessity, she realized. A valuable necessity, kept comfortable and provided for, because she was the only person Finn trusted. The only one who could keep him calm and healthy enough to fulfill his biological imperative. But there was dignity in necessity, wasn't there? She was no longer dependent on Cressida's cruelty. She had purpose, shelter, and the means to care for the one creature who had loved her father as much as she had. It was more than she'd had that morning. It would have to be enough. Adeline discovered the locked wing on her 5th morning at Atherton Abbey, purely by accident. Finn had developed an unfortunate habit of chasing the Abbey's resident mice through corridors that grew progressively darker and more neglected the further they wandered from the inhabited portions of the house. She had been pursuing him through what she thought was a servant's passage when she rounded a corner and found herself facing an ornate door of dark oak, its surface carved with intricate patterns of hounds and oak leaves. The door was locked, but age and moisture had warped the frame just enough that when Finn squeezed through the gap at the bottom, Adeline found she could push it open with considerable effort. The corridor beyond was thick with dust and the peculiar silence of a place that had been deliberately forgotten. Holland covers draped the furniture like shrouds, and the air tasted of abandonment. Pale rectangles on the wallpaper marked where paintings had once hung, their absence more haunting than their presence would have been. Finn's excited barking echoed from somewhere ahead. "Finn, come back here this instant," Adeline called, gathering her skirts to navigate the dusty floor. She passed closed doors and shuttered windows, each step taking her deeper into this forgotten realm of the Abbey, until she reached a room at the corridor's end where weak morning light filtered through gaps in the heavy curtains. The portrait dominated the far wall, escaping the indignity of a Holland cover through sheer size. It depicted a woman in the dress of the last century, perhaps 50 years past, judging by the style of her gown. She was beautiful in a fierce, uncompromising way, with dark hair piled high and eyes that seemed to challenge the viewer. Her hand rested on the head of a terrier who sat at her feet with alert attention. And even through decades of accumulated grime on the painting's surface, Adeline could see the distinctive markings. The white blaze, the pattern of brindle, the exact shape of the ears. It was Finn, or his precise ancestor, immortalized in oils and varnish. Finn himself had discovered the portrait and was now sitting before it, head tilted in apparent contemplation of his painted predecessor, tail thumping against the dusty floor. "Who was she?" Adeline whispered, moving closer to examine the small brass plate affixed to the ornate frame. "Charlotte Blackwood, Duchess of Atherton, 1781 to 1809, and faithful companion." The door behind her creaked open. Adeline spun, her heart lurching, to find the Duke filling the doorway. His expression was utterly unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw that suggested she had crossed some invisible boundary. "Your Grace, I apologize. Finn got loose and I was only trying to—" "How did you open this door?" His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the words. "It was already open. That is, the frame is warped, and Finn squeezed through, and I only—" She stopped, realizing how feeble the explanation sounded. "I should not have intruded. I'll leave immediately." But the Duke was no longer looking at her. His gaze had fixed on the portrait with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. He moved into the room slowly, as if approaching something sacred or dangerous, until he stood before the painting. The silence stretched unbearably. "She was my great-great-grandmother," he said finally. "She died when the abbey caught fire. The east wing, the wing where you now reside, was completely destroyed. It took 3 years to rebuild." Adeline waited, sensing there was more, that the story had not yet reached its crucial point. "The fire started in the kennels," the Duke continued, his voice hollow. "The Atherton hunting line was housed there, 17 dogs, representing 200 years of careful breeding. Charlotte ran into the burning building to save them." He paused, and when he spoke again, something raw had entered his tone. "She managed to release most of them, but she went back for the last one, a pregnant female who had hidden in the smoke. They found Charlotte's body beside the dog. Both had perished." Finn whimpered softly, as if sensing the weight of the tragedy. "But the other dogs survived?" Adeline asked. "Scattered across the moors in terror. By the time they were rounded up, only 3 remained, 2 males and an elderly female, past breeding age. The line deteriorated rapidly after that. Inbreeding, poor management, lack of knowledge." The Duke's hands clenched at his sides. "Within a generation, they were declared extinct. A 200-year legacy, gone because my great-great-grandfather prioritized rebuilding the house over preserving what Charlotte had died to save." He turned to look at Adeline directly, and she saw something in his eyes she had not seen before. A kind of desperate intensity that went beyond mere duty. "Do you understand now, Miss Harrington? This is not about a dog. This is about a promise that was broken, a duty that was failed. A woman who sacrificed everything and whose sacrifice was rendered meaningless by the negligence of those who came after." "But Finn," Adeline began. "Finn is a miracle," the Duke said flatly. "Your father must have acquired a breeding pair decades ago, perhaps without knowing their true lineage. Somehow, impossibly, the bloodline survived in obscurity while we thought it lost forever." He moved closer to the portrait, reaching out as if to touch it, then letting his hand fall. "Charlotte made my family swear an oath before she died. Witnesses heard her exact words in her final moments. She made them promise that the Atherton line would endure, that her death would not be in vain." The weight of that oath seemed to press down on the dusty room like a physical force. "Every Duke since has lived with the knowledge that we failed her," he continued. "That we let the line die out within a single generation of her sacrifice. My father spent a fortune trying to recreate the breed from historical records. He died believing he had failed the family honor irrevocably." "And then you found Finn," Adeline said softly. "And then I found Finn." The Duke's gaze shifted to the terrier, who had abandoned his contemplation of the portrait and was now attempting to dig through a particularly interesting section of carpet. The last chance to honor Charlotte's sacrifice. The last opportunity to prove that the Atherton family keeps its promises, even if it takes a century. Adeline looked between the painted Duchess and the living Duke, understanding for the first time the true weight of the burden he carried. This was not about aristocratic pride or the preservation of a valuable bloodline. This was about redemption, about correcting a failure that had haunted his family for generations. "She must have been extraordinary," Adeline said, studying Charlotte's fierce painted eyes. "She was everything a duchess should be. Brave, devoted, unwilling to abandon those in her care, even at the cost of her own life." The Duke's voice had gone distant. Sometimes I wonder what she would think of us now, of how thoroughly we failed the one thing she asked. But you haven't failed, Adeline protested. Finn is here. The line can continue. The Duke finally looked at her, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just the weight of duty, but something darker. Fear. He can continue the line only if he survives long enough to breed, Miss Harrington. Only if we can find a suitable mate. Only if nothing goes wrong. His jaw tightened. I will not fail Charlotte again. I cannot. The words hung in the dusty air like a vow, or a curse. Finn began vomiting just after midnight. Adeline woke to the sound of retching, her heart immediately racing as she lit the bedside candle with trembling hands. The terrier was huddled in the corner of her room, his small body convulsing as he brought up the contents of his stomach onto the expensive carpet. Finn! Oh God, Finn! She was out of bed immediately, her nightdress billowing as she knelt beside him. His nose was hot and dry, his breathing labored, and when she tried to soothe him, he whimpered in a way that sent ice through her veins. Earlier that evening, a new footman, young, nervous, with a London accent, had brought Finn's dinner. Adeline had thought nothing of it at the time, had simply thanked him and set the bowl down for Finn to eat while she took her own meal. The footman had lingered awkwardly in the doorway, watching, before finally departing. The memory took on sinister new dimensions as Finn retched again, bringing up nothing but bile. Adeline didn't bother with a wrapper or slippers. She ran through the darkened corridors of Atherton Abbey in her bare feet, the candle flame streaming behind her, until she reached the Duke's private chambers in the West Wing. A section of the house Mrs. Holloway had firmly indicated was absolutely forbidden to her. She pounded on the door with her fist. Your Grace! Your Grace, please, something's wrong with Finn. The door opened so quickly she nearly struck the Duke's chest. He stood before her in shirt sleeves and unbuttoned waistcoat, his dark hair disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it. For a moment, he simply stared at her unbound hair falling past her shoulders, her bare feet, her nightdress visible beneath the open dressing gown she had grabbed at the last moment. Then his eyes sharpened. What's happened? He's sick. Vomiting, fever. I don't know what's wrong, her voice broke. Please, you have to come. The Duke moved past her without bothering to button his waistcoat or retrieve a coat, his long strides forcing her to nearly run to keep pace. When they reached her chambers, Finn had collapsed onto his side, his breathing shallow and rapid. The transformation in the Duke was immediate and absolute. All the careful control, the aristocratic distance, the rigid formality, it shattered like glass. He dropped to his knees beside the terrier, his hands moving over Finn's body with practiced efficiency, checking pulse and temperature and reflexes with the focused intensity of someone who had done this before. Get me cool water and cloths, he ordered, his voice tight. And send for Dr. Whitmore immediately. No, wait. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something that looked very much like terror. Who prepared his food tonight? A new footman. I'd never seen him before. He had a London accent. The Duke's expression went deadly cold. Describe him. She did, watching as the Duke's jaw clenched tighter with each detail. That's no footman of mine. He returned his attention to Finn, carefully opening the dog's mouth to examine his gums. Someone sent him. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. His hands were shaking now, barely perceptible tremors that he couldn't quite control. The symptoms. This could be oleander or foxglove. Something meant to look like natural illness. Will he? Adeline couldn't finish the question. I don't know. The words seemed torn from him, I don't know, and that's... He stopped, visibly fighting for composure. Get the water, now! Adeline rang for a maid, sent her running for Dr. Whitmore and the requested supplies, then returned to find the Duke had gathered Finn into his lap. The powerful aristocrat who commanded absolute authority was cradling the small terrier against his chest, one hand stroking the rough fur with a gentleness that made Adeline's throat tighten. You can't die, the Duke whispered to the unconscious dog. Do you understand me? You can't die. Not like this. Not when I finally... His voice cracked. Not again. I won't fail again. Adeline knelt beside them, her hand instinctively reaching out to rest on the Duke's shoulder. She felt him stiffen at the contact, then slowly, incrementally, lean into it. Tell me what to do, she said quietly. Keep him cool, keep him breathing. The Duke's eyes were fixed on Finn's labored chest. And pray, Miss Harrington. Pray that whoever did this didn't use enough to kill him. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour. An elderly man with kind eyes who took one look at the scene, the Duke still holding Finn. Adeline kneeling beside them in her nightclothes, the basin of vomit carefully preserved as evidence, and asked no questions about propriety. Poison? He asked simply. I suspect so, the Duke replied, his voice hoarse. The examination was thorough and tense. Dr. Whitmore administered charcoal mixed with water, checked Finn's heart rate repeatedly, and finally sat back on his heels with a cautious expression. If it was poison, it wasn't a fatal dose. He's young and strong. With careful nursing through the night, I believe he'll recover. He looked between the Duke and Adeline. But someone will need to stay with him. Watch for changes in breathing. Keep him warm, but not hot. Give him small amounts of water if he'll take it. I'll stay, the Duke and Adeline said simultaneously. Dr. Whitmore's eyebrows rose fractionally, but he merely nodded. Then I'll return at dawn to check his progress. He paused at the door. Your Grace, I'll send word to the magistrate about the footman, and I'll have Mrs. Holloway conduct a thorough review of the staff. After he left, silence filled the room. The Duke had moved to the chair beside Adeline's bed, Finn still cradled in his arms. Adeline sat on the floor beside them, her back against the chair, too exhausted and frightened to care about the impropriety of the situation. You should rest, the Duke said finally. I'll watch him. I can't sleep. Adeline reached up to stroke Finn's ear, her fingers brushing against the Duke's hand. Neither of them pulled away. He's my responsibility too. Your stepsister. The Duke's voice was flat with certainty. This was her doing. You can't know that. Who else would want Finn dead? Who else would benefit from his death? His arms tightened around the terrier. She inherits your father's estate if you leave Atherton, and you would have to leave if Finn died. The logic was sound and chilling. I didn't think she would go this far, Adeline whispered. People will do terrible things when they feel they've been cheated of what they believe they deserve. The Duke's gaze was distant. I've learned that lesson more than once. They lapsed into silence again. But it was different now. No longer the careful, formal distance they had maintained. This was the silence of shared vigil, of mutual fears slowly giving way to fragile hope as Finn's breathing gradually steadied. Why did you say not again? Adeline asked softly as the candles burned low. Earlier, you said you wouldn't fail again. The Duke was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. When I was 12, my father acquired a pair of terriers he believed might carry Atherton blood. I was tasked with their care. His hand continued its rhythmic stroking of Finn's fur. I was young, careless. I left the kennel door unlatched one night. They got into the gardens, ate something toxic. Both died before morning. You were a child, Adeline said gently. I was a duke's son, old enough to understand duty. His jaw clenched. My father didn't speak to me for a month. Said I had proven myself unworthy of the Atherton name. That I was as negligent as the great-grandfather who let Charlotte's legacy die. That's cruel. That's truth. But there was no conviction in the words. Only old, tired pain. I swore I would never be that careless again. That if I ever had another chance, I would not fail. Adeline understood then. The rigid control, the obsessive attention to detail, the inability to see Finn as anything other than a sacred duty. The Duke had been carrying this failure for 20 years, waiting for a chance at redemption. You haven't failed, she said firmly. Finn is alive. He's going to recover. Because of you. The Duke finally looked at her, really looked at her, and in the candlelight his expression was stripped of all aristocratic distance. You noticed something was wrong. You acted immediately. You saved him. We saved him, Adeline corrected. The Duke's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers interlacing with hers where they both rested on Finn's warm side. Yes, he said quietly. We did. They sat that way until dawn broke over the moors. Two people keeping watch over one small dog, the careful boundaries between them dissolving in the shared vulnerability of the night. Can we pause here for just a moment? Because if this scene, two broken people learning to trust again, finding strength in shared vulnerability, if this touched your heart at all, I need you to understand something. When you hit that subscribe button, you're not just telling me you enjoyed this. You're telling YouTube to show this story to someone else who's sitting alone right now, convinced they're too damaged to be loved. Someone who needs to hear that healing is possible. That scruffy little terrier named Finn might seem like just a dog, but for someone out there, this story could be the reminder that unexpected blessings can come from the smallest things. Don't let them miss it. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs hope today. Now, let's see what Tristan finally confesses. Finn recovered with the resilience of youth and stubborn terrier spirit. But the poisoning had shifted something fundamental in the careful architecture of Atherton Abbey. The Duke no longer took his meals in solitary formality. Instead, he appeared each evening in Adeline's sitting room, ostensibly to check on Finn's progress, but lingering over tea long after the dog had been examined and declared healthy. It was during one of these visits, a week after the incident, that Adeline finally asked the question that had been weighing on her since that long night of vigil. You said you failed before, with the terriers your father acquired. But there's something more, isn't there? Something you haven't told me. The Duke stood at the window, looking out over the darkening moors. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the landscape into watercolor abstractions. For a long moment, she thought he would retreat behind his usual walls of aristocratic reserve. Then he spoke. My father was not a kind man, Miss Harrington. He was a duke who believed that title was synonymous with infallibility, and that any failure was a moral defect rather than a human weakness. The Duke's reflection in the glass was hollow. When the terriers died because of my negligence, he decided I needed to learn the true weight of duty. I was 13 when he gave me my next test. Adeline set down her teacup, sensing the importance of what was coming. There was a mare, the Duke continued, his voice carefully controlled. Atherton's pride. descended from a line my family had bred for 2 centuries. She was old, past her breeding years, but my father valued her as the foundation of our stables. He made me responsible for her care, personally responsible. I was to feed her, groom her, exercise her, manage every aspect of her welfare. That seems a heavy burden for a boy of 13. It was meant to be. It was punishment disguised as education. The Duke turned from the window, and in the firelight, his face looked younger, more vulnerable. I took it seriously. I did everything correctly, followed every instruction, maintained meticulous records, never missed a single feeding or grooming session. I was determined to prove I was not careless, that I could be trusted with something valuable. He moved to the fireplace, bracing one hand against the mantel, his shoulders tense. "What happened?" Adeline asked softly. "My cousin Edmund came to visit that winter. He was 17, charming, and utterly irresponsible. He decided it would be entertaining to take Atherton's Pride out for a midnight ride across the moors, despite the ice and snow." The Duke's knuckles whitened against the stone. "I caught him in the stables, tried to stop him. We fought, physically fought. He was older, stronger. He knocked me unconscious and took the mare anyway." Adeline's hand went to her mouth. They found her the next morning at the bottom of Raven's Gorge, her legs shattered. Edmund had been thrown clear with nothing but bruises and a convenient story about how I had left the stable door unlatched. The Duke's voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way of someone recounting unbearable pain. My father believed him. Or perhaps he simply needed someone to blame, and Edmund was the heir to an earldom, while I was merely his disappointing son. Surely when you explained, I tried. The Duke laughed, but there was no humor in it. I told my father exactly what happened. He called me a liar, trying to avoid responsibility for my negligence. He said I was attempting to destroy Edmund's reputation to save my own. He finally looked at Adeline, and his eyes were ancient with old grief. The mare had to be destroyed. 200 years of careful breeding ended because I was too weak to prevent my cousin's recklessness. "That's not failure," Adeline said fiercely. "That's being overpowered by someone larger and stronger. That's being made a scapegoat for another's crime." My father didn't see it that way. The scandal was significant. The Atherton family losing another piece of their legacy. This time through the gross negligence of the Duke's own son. It was whispered about in every drawing room in London. The Duke's jaw clenched. He sent me away to school a week later. Told me not to return until I had learned what it meant to be worthy of the Atherton name. How long? 3 years. I was 16 when he finally allowed me home. The Duke moved to sit in the chair opposite Adeline, his exhaustion suddenly visible. By then, I had learned to feel nothing. To view duty as the only thing that mattered, emotion as a weakness that led to failure. If I cared for nothing, I could not fail to protect it. Adeline understood then. The rigid control, the insistence on contracts and formal arrangements, the inability to acknowledge Finn as anything other than a valuable object. The Duke had armored himself against feeling because feeling had once cost him everything. "What happened to your cousin Edmund?" she asked. "He inherited his earldom and drank himself to death by 30. The Duke's expression was grim. My father never apologized, never acknowledged he had been wrong. He died believing I was fundamentally flawed, incapable of protecting what mattered. And you believed it too." The Duke was silent, which was answer enough. "Is that why you were so desperate to find Finn?" Adeline pressed. "Why you traveled to London the moment you discovered he existed?" It wasn't just about honoring Charlotte's sacrifice. It was about proving to yourself that you could succeed where you had failed before. I cannot allow the Atherton line to die with Finn. The words came out raw, stripped of all aristocratic composure. I cannot fail again. If Finn dies, if the bloodline ends, it proves that my father was right, that I am incapable of protecting what has been entrusted to me, that I am unworthy of the name I carry. That's not true, Adeline said firmly. Isn't it? The Duke looked at her with something like desperation. 2 terriers died because I left a door unlatched. A mare died because I couldn't fight off my cousin. Every failure proves the same thing, that I am not strong enough, not careful enough, not worthy enough. Adeline set down her tea and moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hand in both of hers. He stiffened at the contact, but didn't pull away. You were a child, she said fiercely. A child given impossible responsibilities by a cruel man who used your failures to justify his own coldness. The terriers died because you were 12 and made a mistake. The mare died because your cousin was reckless and your father was a coward who blamed you rather than facing an uncomfortable truth. Miss Harrington, Adeline, she interrupted. If we're to keep Finn safe, if we're to face whatever Cressida sends against us next, then we must be honest with each other. And I am telling you honestly, you are not your failures. You are not defined by what you couldn't prevent as a child. The Duke stared at their joined hands, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't know how to be anything else. Then learn, Adeline said softly. Learn with me. Learn with Finn. We are not your father's tests or your cousin's victims. We are people who, she hesitated, then pressed forward, who care about you. Not the Duke. You. His fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment they sat in silence, broken only by the crackling fire and Finn's soft snoring from his cushion. When I found Finn, the Duke said finally, I thought it was Providence giving me one final chance. One last opportunity to prove I could protect something valuable. That I could honor a duty without failing. He looked up at her, and his eyes were storm gray and achingly vulnerable. I never expected that in saving him, I might save myself. You're not saved yet, Adeline said with a gentle smile. You're still treating this as a duty, rather than she searched for the right word, a gift. I don't understand the difference. Duty is burden. Gift is choice. She squeezed his hand. You chose to protect Finn. You chose to bring me here. You chose to sit vigil all night when he was poisoned. Those weren't obligations. Those were choices made from something deeper than duty. The Duke was quiet for a long time, processing this. My father would say, that's weakness, he finally said. Your father, Adeline replied firmly, was wrong about a great many things. Outside, the rain intensified, but inside, something fragile and new was taking root. The possibility that the Duke of Atherton might learn to be simply Tristan, and that being Tristan might be enough. The invitation to the Marchioness of Westfield's autumn ball arrived on heavy cream cardstock. The calligraphy so elegant, it seemed to mock Adeline's modest circumstances. The Duke delivered it himself, appearing in her sitting room with an expression that suggested he was about to ask something he found deeply uncomfortable. You'll need a new gown, he said without preamble, setting the invitation on the table beside her abandoned needlework. Mrs. Holloway will arrange for a modiste from York. Spare no expense. Adeline stared at the invitation, her stomach tightening. Your Grace, I don't understand. Surely my presence isn't required at— It is required? The Duke's tone was firm. There will be several breeders in attendance, including Lord Pemberton, whose estate houses what may be the only suitable mate for Finn. I need to negotiate breeding rights, and it would be— He paused, choosing his words carefully. Advantageous for you to be seen as part of my household, to establish your legitimacy as Finn's custodian. What he meant, Adeline understood, was that she needed to be presented as something more than a charity case or a servant. She needed to appear as if she belonged at Atherton Abbey, as if her presence there was proper and unquestionable. "Will Finn come with us?" she asked. Discreetly. Lord Pemberton will want to see him. The Duke's expression softened slightly. I won't let him out of our sight, Adeline. I promise. It was the first time he had used her given name outside of their private conversations, and the intimacy of it sent warmth through her chest. The gown the modiste created was a masterpiece in deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in Adeline's eyes and made her pale skin luminous rather than sickly. When she descended the stairs on the evening of the ball, the Duke was waiting in the entrance hall, resplendent in black evening dress that emphasized his aristocratic bearing. He stared at her for a long moment, something flickering in his gray eyes that might have been admiration. You look, he began, then seemed to reconsider. That will do nicely. But his hand trembled slightly as he helped her into the carriage, and Adeline allowed herself a small, secret smile. The Marchioness of Westfield's estate blazed with light, every window glowing like a jewel box as carriages disgorged London's finest onto the sweep of the circular drive. Adeline's courage nearly failed as she saw the glittering crowd, but the Duke's hand at her elbow was steady. Remember, he murmured as they entered, you are under the protection of Atherton. No one would dare question your presence. Finn had been smuggled in via a servant's entrance and was being kept in a private study, guarded by the Duke's most trusted footman. The plan was for Lord Pemberton to view him there, away from the curious eyes of society. The ballroom was a crush of silk and jewels, champagne and whispered gossip. Adeline felt eyes turn toward her, saw fans flutter as matrons leaned together to speculate about the unknown woman on the Duke of Atherton's arm. The Duke, seemingly oblivious to the attention, guided her through the crowd with practiced ease. Then Adeline saw her. Cressida stood near the refreshment table in a gown of emerald silk that probably cost more than Adeline's father's entire quarterly income. Her stepmother's pearls gleamed at her throat, pearls that should have been Adeline's inheritance. But it was the expression on Cressida's face that made Adeline's blood run cold. Pure, undiluted hatred. Your Grace, a woman's voice interrupted. Lady Pemberton, wife of the breeder they'd come to see, swept forward with practiced social grace. How delightful to see you. And who is this charming creature? Miss Adeline Harrington, the Duke said smoothly. She is residing at Atherton Abbey as custodian of a rather valuable animal I've recently acquired. How fascinating. Lady Pemberton's eyes gleamed with curiosity. You must tell me more. My husband is quite interested in viewing this miraculous discovery of yours. As the Duke and Lady Pemberton discussed arrangements for the private viewing, Adeline felt the weight of stares intensifying. She turned slightly and caught Cressida watching her with an expression of such venom it made her breath catch. Then Cressida smiled, a slow, calculated smile that promised retribution, and turned to whisper something to the elegantly dressed woman beside her. The poison spread through the ballroom like oil across water. Adeline couldn't hear the words, but she could see their effect. Fans snapped open to conceal moving lips. Eyebrows rose in scandalized arcs. Glances shifted from curious to judgmental. Within 20 minutes, the whispers had created a perceptible chill in the air around her. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton appeared, a portly man with kind eyes and an enthusiasm for his subject that was immediately apparent. "Shall we adjourn to view this remarkable specimen?" The Duke's hand found Adeline's elbow again. "Miss Harrington's presence is essential. She is the only one Finn truly trusts." They made their way to the private study where Finn waited, but Adeline could feel the weight of speculation following them through the corridors. Once the door closed behind them, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Finn greeted her with his usual enthusiastic yapping, tail wagging so hard his entire body shook. Lord Pemberton's eyes widened as he took in the terrier's distinctive markings. "Extraordinary," he breathed, kneeling to examine Finn with the reverence of a man viewing a holy relic. The blaze, the brindle pattern, even the ear set. It's exactly as the historical descriptions detail. "Your Grace, this is unprecedented." The Duke's expression held carefully controlled triumph. "I hoped you would agree. I understand you have a female who might carry compatible bloodlines?" As the two men discussed breeding arrangements with the technical precision of horse traders, Adeline focused on keeping Finn calm. The terrier seemed to sense the importance of the occasion and was mercifully well behaved, sitting still for Lord Pemberton's examination, with only occasional attempts to lick the man's face. A knock at the door interrupted them. The Duke's footman entered, his face pale. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" The Duke's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "A servant has been caught attempting to access this room, Your Grace. He claims he was hired to retrieve the dog." The Duke and Adeline exchanged a single glance of shared understanding. Cressida. "Lord Pemberton, if you'll excuse me for a moment," the Duke said with icy politeness. "Miss Harrington, stay with Finn. Do not open this door for anyone but me." After he left, Adeline gathered Finn into her lap, her heart pounding. Through the closed door, she could hear raised voices, the Duke's cutting through with aristocratic authority. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Harrington, I hope you won't think me impertinent, but there are rather unpleasant rumors circulating about you this evening." Adeline's stomach dropped. "What kind of rumors?" "That you inveigled your way into the Duke's household through deception. That the dog isn't rightfully yours, but was stolen from your stepfamily. That you're a fortune hunter using an animal to trap a Duke into an inappropriate arrangement." He looked genuinely distressed. "I don't believe such gossip, of course, but I thought you should be aware." So that was Cressida's strategy. Unable to poison Finn successfully, she was poisoning Adeline's reputation instead, making it socially impossible for her to remain at Atherton Abbey. If society believed Adeline was a schemer, the Duke would be forced to distance himself or face scandal. The door opened, and the Duke returned, his expression carved from granite. "The servant has confessed to being approached by a woman in emerald silk," he said flatly. "She offered him £50 to steal the dog and deliver it to a carriage waiting at the servant's entrance." His eyes met Adeline's. "She claimed the dog was stolen property, and you were a fraud." "Your Grace, I never," Adeline began. "I know." The Duke's voice softened fractionally. "I know exactly who orchestrated this, and I know why." He turned to Lord Pemberton. "My lord, I apologize for this disruption. Perhaps we could continue our discussion at Atherton Abbey next week, under more controlled circumstances?" "Of course, Your Grace." Lord Pemberton bowed, but his expression was troubled. "Though I must warn you, the rumors tonight will spread. By tomorrow, all of London will be discussing Miss Harrington's supposed deception. Then by tomorrow, the Duke said with quiet steel, all of London will learn what happens when someone attempts to destroy a woman under my protection. He offered Adeline his arm. Finn tucked securely under his other arm, and together they walked back into the ballroom. Every eye turned toward them. The whispers crescendoed into a wave of barely concealed gossip. And there, at the center of it all, stood Cressida, her smile triumphant. She had won the first battle. But the war, Adeline realized as she felt the Duke's arm steady beneath her hand, was far from over. The Duke led Adeline directly to the center of the ballroom, Finn still tucked under his arm, their progress through the crowd as deliberate as a military march. The orchestra faltered into silence. Conversations died mid-sentence, every eye in the Marchioness of Westfield's ballroom fixed on the unlikely trio with the avid attention of spectators anticipating bloodshed. Cressida's smile widened. "Your Grace," she called out, her voice carrying across the hushed room with practiced projection. "How kind of you to bring my dear stepsister into society. Though I must confess surprise that you would risk your reputation for someone of such questionable character." The Duke stopped, turned, and regarded Cressida with the cold attention one might give an insect beneath a microscope. "Miss Albright, I was unaware you had received an invitation to this gathering." A flush crept up Cressida's neck, but she held her ground. "Lady Sutherland was gracious enough to include me." She gestured to the elderly woman beside her, who suddenly looked as if she regretted that graciousness immensely. "I felt it my duty to attend, given that my poor father's stolen property might be present." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "Stolen property?" The Duke's voice was dangerously quiet. "The dog, Your Grace." Cressida moved forward, her emerald skirts swishing dramatically. "That terrier was part of my father's estate. It should have been inherited by me, not spirited away by my stepsister through deception and manipulation." She turned to address the room, playing to her audience. "Adeline always was cunning. She knew exactly what she was doing when she convinced our poor father to give her that worthless animal in his will." "Worthless?" The Duke's eyebrow arched with aristocratic disdain. "A mongrel terrier, nothing more." Cressida's voice dripped with false sympathy. "But Adeline saw an opportunity, didn't she? She discovered Your Grace's obsession with the extinct Atherton line. An obsession born of childhood failure, I believe." The room went utterly still. Adeline felt the Duke's arm tense beneath her hand, saw the muscle in his jaw clench. Cressida had done her research, had uncovered the story of the terriers, perhaps even the mare. She was wielding his past like a weapon. "Everyone knows the Duke of Atherton has been desperate to resurrect his family's hunting line," Cressida continued, warming to her subject. "Desperate enough to be fooled by a clever girl with a scruffy dog and a fabricated story. Tell me, Your Grace, did Adeline claim the dog appeared in a vision? Did she produce convenient evidence of its lineage?" Nervous laughter skittered through the crowd. "My stepsister is remarkably skilled at manipulation," Cressida said, her voice heavy with false concern. "She has clearly exploited Your Grace's well-known vulnerability regarding family legacy. One might even say she's trapped you into an inappropriate arrangement, using your own guilt and desperation against you." The Duke's hand moved to cover Adeline's where it rested on his arm, his fingers warm and steadying. "Are you quite finished, Miss Albright?" His voice cut through the ballroom like a blade through silk. Cressida blinked, momentarily thrown by his lack of visible reaction. "I merely thought Your Grace should know the truth before this deception goes any further." before Adeline ruins your reputation the way she's already. The only reputation being ruined this evening, the Duke interrupted, his voice dropping to a tone that made several people step back involuntarily, is your own. He released Adeline's hand and stepped forward, and there was something in his bearing that transformed him from merely aristocratic to absolutely sovereign. This was not a man defending himself. This was a duke exercising the full weight of generations of power. You accuse Miss Harrington of deception, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. You claim she manipulated me using knowledge of my past. You suggest she is a fortune hunter who has trapped me into an inappropriate arrangement. He paused, letting the accusations hang in the air. These are serious charges, Miss Albright. I assume you have evidence to support them? Cressida's confidence wavered. The evidence is obvious, Your Grace. A common dog, a convenient story. The dog, the Duke said with cutting precision, is the last living descendant of a bloodline declared extinct 40 years ago. A bloodline my family has been attempting to resurrect for 3 generations. He gestured to Lord Pemberton, who stood at the edge of the crowd. Lord Pemberton, you examined the animal this evening. Would you care to share your professional assessment? Lord Pemberton stepped forward, looking uncomfortable but honest. The terrier displays every characteristic of the historical Atherton hunting line, Your Grace. The markings are unmistakable. I would stake my reputation as a breeder on its authenticity. Thank you, Lord Pemberton. The Duke turned back to Cressida. As for Miss Harrington's supposed manipulation of my past failures, yes, Miss Albright, I had failures. I was 12 years old when 2 terriers died in my care. I was 13 when a family mare was destroyed due to circumstances beyond my control. His voice hardened. Those failures shaped me. They taught me the weight of duty and the cost of negligence. They made me the man I am today, a man who does not make claims lightly or accept impostors easily. He withdrew a leather portfolio from inside his coat, the same one Adeline had seen in the carriage that first day. The Atherton Charter, established in the 14th year of Henry IV, grants the Duke of Atherton absolute authority over any animal proven to descend from the royal hunting line. He opened the portfolio, revealing age-yellowed parchment covered in elaborate script and bearing multiple wax seals. This is not a story, Miss Albright. This is law, ancient law, but binding nonetheless. He spread additional documents across a nearby table: genealogical records, breeding charts, historical portraits, witness testimonies. The evidence was overwhelming, presented with the methodical precision of a man who had anticipated exactly this challenge. Furthermore, the Duke continued, his voice taking on an edge that made Cressida visibly pale, I have here a sworn statement from your father's solicitor, Mr. Thornbury, confirming that Harold Harrington deliberately bequeathed the terrier to his daughter Adeline, not through manipulation or deception, but through his own clear wishes, witnessed and documented according to law. That's, Cressida started. I also have, the Duke spoke over her, a confession from the servant you hired this very evening to steal the dog. A servant who will testify that you offered him £50 to commit theft, claiming the animal was your property when you knew full well it had been legally bequeathed to Miss Harrington. Cressida's face had gone from flushed to ashen. You speak of manipulation and deception, the Duke said, his voice dropping to deadly quiet. Yet you are the one who attempted theft. You are the one spreading malicious gossip. And you are the one who orchestrated the poisoning of an irreplaceable animal out of spite and greed. Gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. Cressida stumbled back a step. I have no proof of that last charge, the Duke acknowledged. Yet. But I will find it, Miss Albright. I promise you that. He stepped closer to Cressida, and though he didn't raise his voice, every word landed with the weight of absolute authority. You attempted to destroy an innocent woman's reputation to cover your own crimes. You tried to steal property that was not yours. You endangered an animal of incalculable historical value. He paused, letting the charges sink in. Leave this gathering immediately. Return to London, collect your belongings, and remove yourself from society before I decide to pursue legal action for attempted theft and slander. You can't, Cressida's voice cracked. I am the Duke of Atherton, he said with quiet steel. I can do precisely as I wish. And what I wish, Miss Albright, is never to see your face again. The Marchioness of Westfield stepped forward, her expression glacial. Miss Albright, I believe His Grace has made his wishes clear. I must ask you to leave my home. Cressida looked around the ballroom, seeking support, finding only averted eyes and disapproving stares. The crowd that had hung on her every accusation moments before now regarded her with the collective contempt society reserved for those who overplayed their hand. She fled, her emerald skirts a blur of humiliated retreat. The Duke turned back to Adeline, his expression softening as he took her hand. In front of the entire assembled company, he raised it to his lips. Miss Harrington's honor, he announced to the room, is beyond question. She is under the protection of Atherton, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally. The ballroom erupted into applause, perhaps not all of it sincere, but loud enough to signal that society had chosen its side. Adeline looked up at the Duke, this man who had just weaponized his authority and his painful past to defend her, and felt something shift irrevocably in her chest. This was no longer about duty or contracts or ancient charters. This was something far more dangerous. This was love. The journey back to Atherton Abbey was conducted in near silence. But it was a different quality of silence than the tense formality of their first carriage ride together. Finn slept peacefully on Adeline's lap, exhausted by the evening's excitement, while the Duke sat across from her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dim light of the carriage lamps. Thank you, Adeline said finally, for what you did tonight, for defending me. It was nothing more than the truth. The Duke's voice was carefully neutral, retreating behind the familiar walls of duty and obligation. And something in Adeline snapped. She had watched him face down an entire ballroom tonight. She had seen him wield his authority like a sword, exposing his own painful past to protect her honor. She had felt the way his hand trembled when he touched hers, seen the flash of something raw and unguarded in his eyes when Cressida had threatened her. She was done with pretense, done with careful distance and formal contracts. No, she said firmly. The Duke's eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon? I said no. Adeline carefully moved Finn to the seat beside her and leaned forward, her eyes locked on the Duke's. It wasn't nothing more than the truth. It was a choice. You chose to defend me when you could have simply produced the charter and left it at that. You chose to reveal your past failures when you could have maintained your aristocratic distance. You chose to call Cressida out publicly when a private word to the Marchioness would have sufficed. Adeline, I'm not finished. Her heart was pounding, but she pushed forward. For weeks, you've hidden behind duty, behind contracts and custodial agreements and careful formality. You've treated me as a necessary component of Finn's care, nothing more. But tonight, you didn't defend Finn's custodian. You defended me. The Duke's jaw clenched. It was the appropriate course of action given the circumstances. "Stop it!" Adeline's voice shook with frustration and something fiercer. "Stop hiding behind what's appropriate and dutiful and proper. I deserve more than that. I deserve honesty." "You want honesty?" The Duke's control cracked, his voice rising. "You want me to admit that watching Cressida try to destroy you made me want to tear that ballroom apart with my bare hands? That the thought of losing you terrifies me more than any failure, any scandal, any broken duty?" He stood abruptly, forced to hunch slightly in the confined space of the carriage. "Is that the honesty you're demanding?" "Yes," Adeline said, standing to face him. They were inches apart now, the carriage swaying beneath them. "That's exactly what I'm demanding. Because I am not a responsibility, Tristan. I am not a contract or an obligation or a convenient necessity for Finn's care. I am a woman who has fallen in love with you. And I need to know if what I saw tonight, the fear and the fury and the tenderness, if that was real or just another form of duty." The Duke stared at her, his breath coming hard, his carefully constructed composure shattered. "You love me?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." Adeline reached up to cup his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. "I love you. Not the Duke of Atherton, not the man bound by ancient charters and family obligations. Love Tristan, who sat vigil all night with a sick dog, who confessed his failures and fears, who stood in front of society and chose vulnerability over pride because it was the only way to protect someone he—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain. "Someone he cares about." "Cares about." Tristan laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Adeline, I am terrified every moment of every day that something will happen to you. That Cressida will find another way to hurt you. That you'll realize you deserve better than a man so damaged by his past that he doesn't know how to feel anything without framing it as duty." His hands came up to cover hers, where they rested against his face. "I don't know how to be what you need. I only know how to protect and preserve and fulfill obligations." "Then learn," Adeline said, echoing the words she'd spoken to him weeks ago. "Learn how to be loved. Learn how to accept that you are worthy of more than duty." "I failed everyone who trusted me," Tristan said, his voice raw. "The terriers, the mare, my father's expectations, Charlotte's sacrifice. I have spent my entire life trying to prove I'm not fundamentally broken, and I still don't know if I've succeeded." "You haven't failed me," Adeline said fiercely. "You saved me from Cressida's cruelty. You gave me shelter and purpose and dignity when I had nothing. You trusted me with something you value more than anything in the world. How can you possibly think you failed?" "Because I don't value Finn more than anything in the world anymore," Tristan confessed, his eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "I value you more. And that terrifies me, Adeline. Because everyone I've ever valued, I've lost. Everyone I've tried to protect, I've failed." "You won't fail me." Adeline pulled his face down until their foreheads touched. "Because I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to be my partner. To trust that I'm strong enough to stand beside you, not behind you." "I don't deserve you," Tristan whispered. "Perhaps not," Adeline said with a slight smile. "But you love me anyway, don't you?" The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sound of the carriage wheels and Finn's gentle snoring. "Yes," Tristan finally said, the word torn from somewhere deep and honest. "God help me, yes. I love you so much it feels like drowning and breathing at the same time. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you refuse to let me hide behind my title. I love that you see past the Duke to the broken man beneath and somehow think he's worth saving. Not saving, Adeline corrected. Loving. There's a difference. Tristan's arms came around her, pulling her close with a desperation that spoke of weeks of restraint finally breaking. I don't know how to do this. How to be a husband instead of just a duke. How to build a partnership instead of another contract. We'll learn together. Adeline wrapped her arms around his neck. Just as we learned to protect Finn together. Just as we faced Cressida together. We'll learn this too. Is that a yes? Tristan pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. Because I haven't actually asked properly. I should ask properly. You deserve... Adeline kissed him. It was brief and sweet, and tasted of champagne and hope, and when she pulled back, Tristan looked dazed. That was highly improper, he managed. Good, Adeline said. I'm tired of proper. Ask me. Tristan took her hands in his, and despite the swaying carriage and the sleeping dog and the complete lack of romantic setting, his expression held such raw sincerity that Adeline's breath caught. Adeline Harrington, will you marry me? Not because of a charter or duty or obligation, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to be worthy of you? Yes, Adeline said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Finn chose that moment to wake up and bark enthusiastically, as if offering his approval of the arrangement. Tristan laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that transformed his entire face, and pulled both Adeline and the wriggling terrier into his arms. I inherited only the puppy, Adeline said softly, looking up at the man she loved. And it brought me everything. No, Tristan corrected, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You inherited courage and resilience, and the strength to choose your own destiny. Finn was just the catalyst. A very important catalyst, Adeline said, scratching the terrier's ears. The most important catalyst, Tristan agreed. Though I'm fairly certain he's about to eat the carriage upholstery. They separated Finn from his enthusiastic investigation of the velvet seats, laughing together as the carriage rolled through the Yorkshire night toward Atherton Abbey. Toward home. 3 months later, Adeline stood in the same library where she'd first seen Charlotte's portrait, wearing a wedding dress of ivory silk and holding a bouquet of autumn roses. Finn sat at her feet, wearing a ridiculous bow that Mrs. Holloway had insisted upon, looking tremendously pleased with himself. Through the window, she could see the rebuilt East Wing, no longer a monument to tragedy, but a symbol of restoration. In the kennels beyond, Finn's mate, a lovely terrier Lord Pemberton had provided, was expecting puppies within the month. The Atherton line would continue. Charlotte's sacrifice would be honored. The family's broken promises would be mended. But more than that, Adeline thought as Tristan took her hand and they prepared to descend to the chapel where their guests waited. Something new was beginning. A partnership built not on duty, but on choice. A love that had grown from necessity into something transformative. Ready? Tristan asked softly. Adeline looked at the man who had learned to value love over obligation, who had chosen vulnerability over pride, who had defended her honor without hesitation. Ready, she said, ready. And together, with one scruffy terrier leading the way, they walked toward their future. Her true inheritance, Adeline realized, had never been her father's estate or her mother's jewels. It had been the courage to accept love when it came, the strength to demand honesty, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the smallest, most unlikely gifts like a terrier named Finn, could change everything. If you made it all the way to the end of Adeline and Tristan's story, you're my people. You believe in second chances, in healing, in love that's earned, not easy. But here's what haunts me every single night. Statistically, only 3% of you will subscribe. That means 97 of you will watch this, feel everything you just felt, and then nothing. Tomorrow, when I post a story about the widow who inherited a crumbling estate, or the scarred soldier who learned to love again, you won't see it. And maybe, just maybe, that would have been the story that changed your entire week. The one you needed. The one you would have shared with your heartbroken friend. Please don't let that happen. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this channel with one person who deserves to believe in beautiful endings. We're building something special here. A community that still believes love and redemption matter. Be part of it. I'll see you in the next story, my beautiful family. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.